I want to welcome everybody to what is the kickoff of the first actual speaker event for our 15th annual Adam Smith Week. To my students, yes, I did post that we were going to have a guest lecture today, so that meant other people. So if you look a little confused, yes, we're going to do things just a little bit differently today. No attendance sheet for you and so forth, right? But there is the extra credit form, so make sure you do that. So I want to welcome everyone. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Professor Peter Calcano. I'm Professor of Economics and the Director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. The mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. We do this through a variety of programming. But one of the things that has endured over our 15 years is Adam Smith Week. We have been doing this since day one, or since year one, and it's a program that has become sort of our marquee or flagship program that everyone recognizes. And in fact, I want to take into account that we actually have several visitors here. We have students from Francis Marion University. We have teachers visiting us from Colorado. We do have other visitors, and our guest speakers that are here for the course of the week are here in our audience with us. So I want to thank all of them for coming out and attending. We've got visiting faculty from other universities here that are taking part in this. And so I want to thank everybody for coming out. The center does a variety of programming, Adam Smith Week being one. We do a host of other things, though, that maybe not as visible. We support faculty research. We do a regular reading group. Several of you in here, I know, are in our economic book colloquium. And we do a variety of other sort of speaker events. We have a regular other speaker series. I would encourage you to, if you're interested in learning more about the center, to grab some of our literature on the way out. It'll detail all the things that we do. In addition, you can find us on all the social media platforms. So if you want to follow what's going on. So today, we have an event at now at 1:40. And then we have our second event this evening at 6 o'clock with Dr. Emily Hamilton, who will be speaking with us. So we're looking forward to all of the events today, and there are multiple events tomorrow as well. So I would encourage you to check out the schedule. You can find all the information you want at go.cfc.edu/ASW. One of the programs that is probably our newest, but has probably been becoming quickly one of our most important, is our Market Process Scholar program. And this is our mentorship program. And here we have our students do a variety of things, including take field trips. They have been and met with some of the people that are here this week on some of those field trips. We have, they participate in all of our events. They do research. And one of the things that we have them do is actually be part of our programming in this regard. And so I want to introduce one of our Market Process Scholars to come up and introduce our speaker for this afternoon. So I want to bring up Katie Greer to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Ryan Yonk.
Hey everybody, my name is Katie, and I'm a Market Process Scholar here, and I have the pleasure of introducing Ryan Yonk, who we actually got to go see up in action in Boston, Massachusetts at the beginning of this year because he is a senior research fellow at AIER. So when Mr. Yonk was our age, he majored at political science and government at Utah State University. He then got his master's in political economy, and then after that he received a PhD from Georgia State University, also in political science. Mr. Yonk started out as an assistant professor of political science and the director of the Institute for Policy Analysis at Southern Utah University. After 3 years there, he became the director of academic research at Strata Policy, where he worked to find voluntary solutions to modern policy issues. For the past 9 years, he's worked at Utah State University in the political science department, and he's also been an assistant professor and research director of the Institute of Political Economy. And again, right now, he's a senior research fellow at American Institute for Economic Research, so we're very excited to have him speak today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so we're going to do a couple of things right at the start here, apparently one of which involves me being outsmarted by a mic stand. So I have a sense of who's in the room. How many of you are in Pete's class and therefore here under duress? How many of you are in Pete's class? Okay, welcome. I'm so excited that you're here, even though you had no actual choice in the matter. Hopefully you will enjoy it. For those of you that came of your own free will and volition, well, we're going to see how the next about 45 minutes or so go. So as I said, I'm with the American Institute for Economic Research. I'm a senior faculty fellow there. And the American Institute for Economic Research's mission is to really explore economics from the practical side as well as the theoretical side. And we work to do that by conducting our own research, by communicating that research to the general public, and then by doing things like training students and others in the ideas. And so it's with that sort of basic notion that we're going to go ahead and get started. Melinda, where are we at on the Zoom feed?
We're still waiting on Jesse to get back for the camera, but we can.
There is Jesse. So we, as is always the case, if you ever come to these sorts of events, there will always and forever be some technical glitch that will put the person in the front of the room figuring out how to stall for a minute or two. So we're gonna hold tight and give him a chance to plug in some chords, and then we're gonna jump into the material so that our friends on Zoom can join us as well. See if I can keep talking for a minute or two more. So. One of the interesting things that I've found is I've come to a few of these over the years, usually just as a visitor, although AIER also has increasingly been a part of what Pete's doing here at the College of Charleston, mostly because what's that?
I'm gonna at least get them sound.
Okay, you're gonna get them sound? All right. I now have a parade of mics in front of me, which will be excellent. Is because of the center here's mission in particular, and if you read it on the screen behind me, advances the understanding of the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. Lines up pretty well with what AIER is trying to do. Now, Pete invited me down to talk about urban planning. And we're going to talk a whole bunch about that over the next little bit. What's the magic buttons I'm supposed to push?
Alt-tab.
Alt-tab. Excellent.
Alt-tab. Like Alt-tab until you see your screen. Or I can just do it.
Thanks, Melinda.
Sorry.
All right. So, this is the title. Why allow planners to do what they do? Or the subtitle is, or why city planners fail to make better communities. So let me ask you a question. What is it that planners do? Anybody? I'll just start pointing. It's lots of fun when I just point. What do planners do? You introduced me. You get to be put on the hot seat first.
Civic plans, but they create structures and like infrastructure.
They create structures. They create infrastructure. Other thoughts? What else do planners do? Anybody studying urban planning at the College of Charleston? It's pretty obvious what planners do, right? Planners like to do what? They really like to plan, right? They like to try to come up with what things should look like, how they should proceed, what's going to happen next. And if you look at it, lots of planners act as a little like these two guys in this little cartoon. So what's going on the cartoon? So you got two planners sitting at a table sketching out the big plan. And the one says to the other, the only problem with town planning is having to account for people. We're going to talk about how lots of planning, especially in the urban sector, proceeds almost exactly down this path. That boy, could we have a beautiful planned city if we just didn't have to deal with those damn people that want to live in the city. And because it's Adam Smith Week, we're going to talk about Smith a little bit. Because Smith makes essentially the same point, but talks about the man of system. How many of you have read anything by Adam Smith? Okay, what have you read? Just shout it out. We're all so quiet and nervous. What have you read? Back there, I saw hands. Wealth of Nations. Other people? Moral Sentiments. Jody in the back for the win. Right? We've all read that sort of stuff. Apparently, we've got Zoom that decided to crop up into my life. But Smith writes about something very similar. And he writes about it in the theory of moral sentiment and talks about the man of system. And I don't know why I'm going to pretend that that's going to be able to just sit there, because there's no way I'm going to stand behind a podium for 40 minutes. So Smith writes that the man of system, on the contrary, is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. Okay, what do you think Smith is saying here? This works really a lot better if you buy the gimmick and talk to me. People are stubborn. People are stubborn in what way? What do you mean by that? Would you like your phone, Melinda? Okay, they believe in their ideas. People that go into particularly planning don't go into planning because they don't think they can plan, right? You don't choose to be an urban planner, for example, if you don't think that there's a way to plan or a way to do those things. And Smith points out that these are men of system. These are men of system that are going to be enamored with the beauty of the plan they create, and that any deviation from it's going to be a problem for them. He goes on, he goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts, without any regard to either the great interests or to strong prejudice which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which hand impresses upon them, but that in general, the great chessboard of humanity, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. So that's the Smithian sort of approach to these things, is because Smith looks at it and says, you've got folks that are going to be attempting to plan for others, and they're going to believe that they can do it, and they're going to create the plans in some detail. And so it's from Smith's jumping off point that I want to start. And I want to start with a story. How many of you know what an apiary is? Okay, what's an apiary? It's a beehive, right? Apiaries are one of the most notorious issues that emerge in lots of town planning documents. Why? Why might apiaries be such a problem?
There's a lot of incentives to get back to the environment and infrastructure.
Okay, so we may want them, right? Because they're going to give back. We may also not want them. Why might we not want apiaries? Full of bees? Go ahead in the back there, gray sweater. Bees can get loose, and people get stung. And I start here because my colleague and I were part of a long-running city planning listserv in the state of Utah. We were on it for 20 years or so. We finally did get kicked off because we kept responding all and saying things like, why do you need a plan? Eventually they kicked us off the listserv and sent us away. But one of the arguments that started on there was there was a desire from someone in a urban area to place a beehive in their backyard. And this long-running discussion came up between the planning and zoning folks, the city planners, and others on this listserv, which included elected officials, about why it was so important that the cities have control over whether or not this guy could put an apiary in his backyard. And this goes on for a while. Eventually it will end up in the Utah legislature as a fight between the cities and a couple of other groups in the state. But at one point in the discussion, as we're talking it through, a city planner responds to, we say something on the order of, it's an apiary. One guy wants to put an apiary in his backyard. What's the big deal? And they respond to us, and this planner from Salt Lake City responds and says, well, what if your kid was allergic to bee stings? Would you feel the same way about an apiary? And we said, well, we would certainly be concerned if our neighbor put it in the backyard with their kid, but we're not sure why you all have a stake in arranging that. Shouldn't the two neighbors sort this out? And they respond, well, if we don't do it, how will it ever be solved? And that discussion kicked off a long run back and forth about, well, then what is city planning and regulation actually meant to do? Is it meant to ease the way we live together, or is it an attempt to actually eliminate all of these problems and create some sort of ideal city? And we're going to walk through some things I think about why most city planners in my mind, especially the ones that are the most sort of optimistic about what planning can do, are trying to remake a city into the ideal city. And then there are others that that work to do a few other things. So let's talk about Charleston for a few minutes. So one of the things that I know we're all concerned about, and there's actually a panel that's going to be on this later in the week, so you should come back if you're interested in these things, and that is affordability of housing and the housing stock in Charleston. What's it like to rent an apartment in Charleston? Easy, hard, cheap, expensive? What's that? Pretty challenging, expensive. Anybody disagree with that assertion? Okay, sounds right. And there is a cycle in Charleston of discussions about affordable housing. How many of you have seen this on the news or read it in the newspaper? Okay, what have you seen and read?
I've seen that since we're coming up close to kind of a recession, that things are just going to keep rising, and people are having a lot of issues finding apartments or homes.
Yeah, there's limited availability, and prices have gone up over the last few years. And this, I think, is rightfully a concern, right? This is something you think about, and you wonder how will people be able to live in Charleston, especially those that don't work in the highest paid industries. And if you read some of these things, you can start to get a sense of sort of the demand. So City of Charleston is searching for a real estate broker that will work on affordable housing. It's going to give discounted rent to first responders and teachers. Then we have a commentary from the Charleston Metro Chamber that we must act now on affordable housing, right? So we can all accept that it's an important issue. In fact, I'll grant that. I look at most of housing and think there's a problem here, especially in places like Charleston or my home city of Salt Lake. We've seen rents rise, outpacing incomes rising, and we look at that and we say, this can be an issue. But as we start to dig into it, we start to see lots of other things. So here's some more local examples. So Charleston has been working on a comprehensive plan change for a while. And a comprehensive plan is sort of the governing document for how development will go in a city and how all the different parts will interact. I'm going to guess you might talk about some of this later tonight, right? Well, that's good, because I don't have to try to explain what it is. I find these documents interminable, and yet I read lots and lots of them. But Charleston's been redoing this plan for a while, and it says, this is the quote from one of the people. This, long story short, we're trying to encourage development on the upland portions of the city and discourage development in the low-lying areas. And the ideal here is to avoid the problems before they start. Okay, they're talking about flooding. How many of you recognize flooding is a problem in Charleston? Okay, what happens in Charleston when floods come? You raised your hand. What's it like?
Disgusting.
What does disgusting mean?
The water is just gross and it's everywhere.
It's gross, it's everywhere, it's not a pleasant thing, okay? And so the city rightfully is concerned about this, right? They're trying to encourage development upland. Okay? They go on, you can find more. The city council has taken other steps in recent years to manage flooding. They approved rules that mandated the first floor of new homes and businesses be 2 feet above a regulation set by the federal government. And they upgraded the city's stormwater regulations to stop new construction from making flooding worse on neighboring properties. The zoning changes the city is considering could be far more comprehensive solution to the city's problem. It would likely cut off risky development before it begins. Okay, what's the commonality between all three of these quotes? Okay, they're going to stop development, right? They're trying to stop it, and they're going to try to channel it. Okay, not building lots of things in floodplains is probably a good idea, right? We can all probably look at that and say, yeah, you probably don't want to have a house where it floods. But they now where do they want to send development? Where's upland from here? What communities might we consider upland from Charleston? What's that? North Charleston. Okay. Louder. Anybody else? Somerville. Okay. Elsewhere? Say that louder. West Corner, Goose Creek. Right. Why do they want to send development there? Is it just that they want to get them out of the floodplain? Okay, there's some land there, right? Where are they not sending it? There's one major community that just shut down, or is trying to shut down new apartment buildings. What's that? Louder. Mount Pleasant. Why? Why doesn't Mount Pleasant want more apartment buildings? Anybody know? You have a thought? Yeah. Okay, there's lots of traffic, right? That's one of the major claims they'll make. Yeah.
I've lived there and I've just seen so many go up so quickly.
Right, so the city pushed a whole bunch of folks off of the lowlands up towards Mount Pleasant, which I wouldn't call upland, but it's certainly not as low as Charleston proper. So the city rezoned some years ago and pushed things that direction. And so what happened when the city pushed them that direction? Well, people went there, right? It was the avenue that was available, and so they went. And now in response to that, there are now objections. And they're going to probably push it somewhere else. There's this notion that they're going to guide development. And if we start to look at all these sorts of things, there is this real dilemma, right? There's an honest-to-God dilemma in Charleston between housing and flooding. You can read through all of this, but we know floods are going to be a problem. We know they're going to damage property, and we know there's going to be issues. And the tool they're most likely to use is the Charleston City Plan. Okay? Again, Emily will talk some about this and share sort of how these things work in some detail, I hope. But it's a tool, as it says, so this is all just taken straight out of the documents from the planners in Charleston. It says, the Charleston City Plan is intended to be a tool and resource for a variety of users. It informs daily decisions made by city staff, planning commission, and council. It also serves as a guide and a reference for residents, local businesses, community organizations, neighboring jurisdictions, developers, and many others who are part of the greater Charleston community. The primary tools used in each comprehend are a list of key recommendations for each element and future land use maps. Detailed strategies and timelines for recommendations are formulated in supplemental plans and studies that have either already been adopted or will be created within the 10-year period of the general plan. What are they going to do in the city plan? What does that sound like? It's going to be a pretty comprehensive attempt to design a city, right? They're going to give you lots of things across all the different aspects of the plan. In fact, in South Carolina, the city plan is required by law. It's mandated It's developed by the Planning Commission and adopted by the City Council. It's revised every 10 years with updates at 5. And the city plan will guide growth in areas within the city of Charleston itself. But it's important to note, it doesn't have anything to say about the wider region or neighboring jurisdictions that exist outside the urban growth boundary. So Charleston's going to plan the city within these boundaries. So let's have a look at the plan itself. Okay, so anybody recognize this diagram? Anybody seen it before? Okay, this is the urban growth boundary. This is the planning area that Charleston's general plan is going to cover. It's going to cover Johns Island, James Island, the peninsula, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but Cainhoy, West Ashley, and Daniel Island. Okay, this is the plan that they're going to have. How geographically large is this area? Is it enormous? It's pretty condensed and small, right? It's not tiny. It's not like it's just the peninsula, but it's a fairly compact area. So, as we start to look at some maps, you can begin to see they divide these things up in detail and start to create the plan of what's going to be allowed in each area. And the typical planning documents look something like this. Okay? The process is going to look something like this. And if you come on Thursday to the panel discussion, you can ask the developers exactly what it's like to try to get something through in Charleston. Because while the plan looks something like this, the actual Charleston City Plan has 9 parts. It's going to cover everything from the population to resilience and equity to community facilities, and we're going to talk specifically about housing. And to talk about housing, we have to start with zoning. Anybody ever seen a map like this before? Well, someday, if you're really unfortunate, you'll go to some planning commission meetings and you will live through these maps. So this is a zoning boundary map, and every color represents a different set of rules about what is allowed and not allowed within that particular area. It's the first thing you notice. Is it a few zones or is it a lot of zones? What do you think? It's a lot of zones, right? Start to look at the base zoning. So this is base zoning, and everything over here on this side are all the different zones that exist. They're going to have slightly different rules about what's allowed. Okay? And you can see there's dark yellow, there's light yellow. They're all going to have different rules and different visions about what should be there because of how they think the city should look and operate. So, given this, how do you know where affordable housing is going to go? Is it going to be allowed, do you think, in every one of these zones? Is this going to be everybody says it can go in any zone? What do you think? What do you all think? Well, if you intuit from what I've said for the last few minutes, the answer is clearly no, and that's right. It's only going to be allowed in some zones and some subzones, despite the fact that it's this major problem that folks have agreed. So over the last about 10 years or so, a little bit longer than that now because this all comes from the draft plan, population in the Charleston region and within the city of Charleston has increased by 20% and 13%. Which has increased the demand for housing in the regions. Over the last 5 years, the city of Charleston experienced high housing growth rate, new units of existing housing stock. Over the past 5 years, the city of Charleston has experienced a growth rate of just under 2% on par with rapidly growing mid-sized cities such as Raleigh and Minneapolis. Despite a steadily growing housing supply, over the last decade, in the city of Charleston, median rent and home sales prices have increased by 51% and 54%, respectively, while household income has only increased by 31%. Although that's an enormous increase in household income, just saying. The Charleston region is the 28th most expensive place to buy a home in the entire country, according to the 2021 report they cite. So here's the conundrum that the city plan lays out. It says, expressed a love for the diversity of their community. So this is after a survey of residents is done. And concerns about the loss of diversity as housing becomes increasingly unattainable for most. There was a resounding call for there to be a mixture of housing that meets the needs of all incomes, levels, life stages, and household size, and for more housing to be located close to where people work. On the same token, many of the community members expressed deep concerns over additional growth and a desire to slow or stop new development, especially given the pressures of flooding, sea level rise, and traffic. Though these concerns are wholly reasonable and warranted, shutting the door on additional growth would have a detrimental impact on an already dire affordability crisis in multiple ways. So what's the conundrum for the planner here? What do people want? What do they want? Anybody? Think it through for a second. This is their summary of all the comments they got back on the general plan's affordable housing section. People say they want two things, right? Jordan. They want more growth, so long as it's not where? Where they live. So they would like there to be a mixture and expansion of units available so that everyone can live in peace and harmony and sing Kumbaya, so long as it doesn't change anything about the status quo in their neighborhood. Now, this is not a surprise. We all express these same exact sentiments, right? If you ask me about our neighborhood in Salt Lake City, I'll tell you I don't want any more damn apartments buildings being built in the neighborhood that I live in. At the same time, I also go before the city council periodically and yell at them for not approving more apartment buildings. This is the conundrum that happens. And so as planners attempt to do this stuff, we get lots and lots of weird outcomes. And one of the weird outcomes I want to talk about is one of the things Charleston has chosen to focus on as its approach to affordable housing. Because given that conundrum, new growth is going to be problematic for Charleston to create within the city limits, right? It's going to be difficult to simply induce enough new units to lower the median price of rent in any really real substantial way. And so the city, to look like they're doing something, has chosen to focus on deeded unit percentage. And a deeded unit is a unit that are deed restricted to offering affordable housing at some multiple or some percentage of income. And Charleston City Plan focuses on trying to increase the percentage of deed restricted affordable housing units from 6% in 2020 to try to grow that percent dramatically. They're going to try to get greater restrictions placed on those units in order to ensure more affordable housing exists. Now, if we take some basic economics here, what's likely to happen to deed restrictions? If you deed restrict a unit to affordable housing prices, what do you think is going to happen to that unit? What happens when you implement rent control? How many of you taken basic economics? What happens to rent-controlled units? Yeah. Okay, it also gets harder to find housing, but it also lowers investment typically in the units, and you see some deterioration of the housing stock, meaning that the base unit is worth less, and if you can't generate rents that can cover the increasing maintenance cost as housing units age, you're likely to see a negative cycle because they can't cycle in and out and raise rents. Deed restrictions attempt to create a permanent sort of version of rent control, limiting it only to use as affordable housing. It's a one step better than a rent control because you go into it knowing that you've bought a deed restricted site, so at least you know what you're getting into rather than the city just implementing it by fiat. But it still has a similar effect. All right, so I walk us through this example for a few reasons. One of the major reasons is I don't see an immediate solution to Charleston's affordable housing problem, given the world it lives in, given the way planners act. Because what's the planner's impulse to try to do here? What are they going to try to do? They're going to try to plan, right? They're going to try to come up with a set of policy interventions that will somehow lead to greater. And they primarily have a single set of tools they're able to use effectively. And that's what I'm going to talk about in particular. And I think it's the more interesting part of what we're going to go through. Because it asks a fundamental question about how we might plan. We've just talked about this first section of planning, what I call public law. So planning that's going to be done through the standard regulatory approach. It's going to be governed by regulation. It's going to be governed through the public sector primarily, acting through the regulatory state, setting a set of rules, making a plan, designing an outcome, and attempting to achieve it. Okay, we all have that sort of directly in our face. And for most urban planners, that's the world they live in, is what I call the world of public law. Okay? But that's not the only possible way to generate plans. There's at least 3 other possible approaches to planning that could be used that includes private law, civil society, and exchange as 3 other major areas. So let's talk a little bit about them. So public law, AKA regulation, that we've just walked through in public, especially in affordable housing, you'll notice at every turn when we talk about the affordable housing story, you've got a planner attempting to use some regulatory arm of the state to take action. It typically prohibits change, absent affirmative, and it tries to set ex ante rules about what will happen to prevent harm or induce a particular outcome. That's the goal of public law. It's why we legislate. We're trying to either induce an outcome or prevent a harm. The second type that I point to that we could potentially use is we could use an ex post approach to planning. We could use what I call private law, or the law of torts and nuisance, that you're responsible for the damage or the cost that your use of your property imposes on others. If they can articulate a claim, we adjudicate the right, so we identify who had the right initially, and then we can use private law to adjudicate. So if you come in and build a new fence that alters the status quo and it causes some damage, then you're liable for that cost. We don't have the state planning and telling us what is in every instance allowable. Instead, we trust that the courts can make an ex post determination about whether or not who was damaged and who held the first right. And at its core is this notion of demonstrated harm. You have to show that you were in some meaningful way harmed by the action. Okay, there's some big old problems with this, right? I'm sure we're all super excited to get more tort lawyers into the world, right? It's a different approach. Instead of using bureaucrats to identify what's allowable, we empower an army of attorneys that will then proceed to sue when they can demonstrate a harm. It's a very different paradigm for how you would manage planning. That typically the rule is that first in time, first in right. So you have the right to use the property the way you've been using it. Someone moves in next door and fundamentally changes, the harm is assigned to them and they have to make recompense or cease to do the tort or the nuisance. It's a different approach, still involves government pretty substantially, but those two are not the only possible ways. So we have public law, this law of regulation. We have private law, the law of tort and nuisance. But we could also use civil society. Okay? This is the Ostromian approach. Most of you have probably never heard of Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom. The Ostroms are pioneering economists. She won a Nobel Prize for her work on the ways of organizing communities that don't necessarily involve government planning and regulation. And what Eleanor points out is that norms and mutual agreements, along with voluntary restrictions, can emerge. we can agree, especially in relatively small communities, how to govern these things. And in many ways, you can think about this as you and your neighbor have a house side by side. We don't generally hate our neighbors. Sometimes we do, and so we decide to torment them. But in general, we don't. And so we go to paint a shed that our neighbor is going to see that borders their property. What do we do? What's the actual process like? Well, we could go to the regulation and say, is there a regulation that governs what's allowable here? We could go to law of torts and nuisance, but that's not typically what we do. We typically go talk to the neighbor, and we figure out a way to work it out. Civil society provides those mechanisms. So short example, again, from my experience in Salt Lake. So we have an urban house, an old Victorian, that there were no setbacks when any of these houses were built. So everything's allowed to be right on the property line. And so our neighbor has a shed. Our neighbor is also a hippie and really likes very, very bright colors on all sorts of things. And they said they were going to paint their shed, and we were like, oh, we wonder what color we're going to get. Well, it turns out, before they went and painted it, they came over and had a conversation about what they wanted to paint, what we expected, and we were able to come to an agreement. Didn't involve the state at all. Okay? And they painted it a lovely, crazy shade of green that's almost entirely hidden by the bushes that we planted in front of it. And this potential conflict, which is what planning is supposed to do, gets solved through mutual cooperation in civil society. Okay? Lots of these sorts of things can emerge. Now, we love to hate on homeowners associations, right? They're fun to talk about their crazy stories, but they're voluntary associations. You move into them, and it's actually a function of civil society operating through voluntary associations that set the rules of the game. Now, you could not like them, you could not want to live in them, but they are part of civil society dealing with them because people have opted in. There was no coercive power that took that property from you and forced it into the state. You purchased it knowing the restrictions. All right, the last one I want to talk about before I end is exchange. Because so far, we've talked about law, we've talked about regulation, we've talked about torts and nuisance, we talked about civil society as a way to solve these things, but the market also gives us a way to solve many of these things. The market approach gives us all sorts of opportunities to engage in trade and planning. Easements are one. Been around in a long time in the U.S. Civil Code. Easements are essentially purchasing the right to use some portion of your neighbor's property rights to access your own. Okay, so I came off of a ranch. We own a large number of easements that cross lots of other people's property. My grandfather was notorious for buying easements. He would roll up to the neighboring farms and talk to them and say, you know, we really don't want to have to cross the stream in the backyard. Will you sell us the right to access our property through yours? Okay? Didn't require an agreement. There was compensation. There was a market transaction that then solved these problems. And as a result, the contracts that existed gave an alternative to the regulatory process. And so while it's not clear exactly how we would implement any of these tomorrow, we've been stuck in the same sort of paradigm for a while of public law as the dominant approach. That what are we going to do? We're going to regulate. We're going to create a plan. How are we going to deal with affordable housing? Well, we're going to try to figure out how can we get more affordable units into the market by some sort of systematized action rather than a wider swath of things. So the place where I want to end is, so why not these other options? Why don't we see more? Why don't we see other changes? And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions, Pete. Happy to answer any questions. How long did I talk? A while. I didn't go over, thank God.
We will some degree on the response. Usually as a courtesy, we let our market process scholars start with the first question, but I'll give her what's that? Do we need the mic to say the questions or?
Yes, I can hear.
So at the beginning you talked about like the city planning within boundaries and like the urban growth boundaries where planning is restricted. If we talk about like decentralizing the planning, how do you think that it would change like growth if there's a lot more like collaboration between different like municipalities without those like barriers in place? If that makes sense.
So there is an increasing tendency to have joint plans between counties, cities, and even regional plans in an attempt to do exactly what you're talking about, which is lower the transaction costs across, and actually it's typically to try to get a more consistent regional plan. So in Massachusetts, for example, they no longer use city plans and county plans. They do regional planning that then the cities have to adopt the regional plan as part of their own city plan. So they can make decisions that only affect the city, but things like transportation, things like corridor decisions, things like sort of big developments, all have to be in accordance with the regional plan in order to try to do it. It ends up creating an even more centralized version of what happens in cities. On the flip side, there are jurisdictions that attempt to zone for dollars, is a term that's sometimes used, which is you lower your restrictions in order to try to get companies to come or more people to live there. And so I actually quite like zoning for dollars because it means you get a plethora of opportunities so long as you don't pay people to come or give tax breaks if people will come. But if you make it easier for them to be there, I tend to be a big fan of that.
Questions?
Greg's got one.
Thanks for the talk. I think Charleston's a really interesting case because this is a city that people come from all over the world to see. So it's not your typical city. And I wonder if you could talk about the original plan for this city seems to be one that's still incredibly attractive today, the compact blocks, the parks, the way that the city was designed is something that people want to come and see and experience and live in. And it seems to be that what's happening now is this conflict with the outskirts of the city, or the growth of the city is now running into this type of modern planning. So could you sort of compare and contrast the historical version of planning with these small city blocks and what they were aspiring to versus what planners do today?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. I'm not a terribly big fan of even early planning attempts, but you do have a distinct difference. And why I observed this when we were walking around downtown earlier today, I think I said, what's really interesting about Charleston is you can see that most of this area is frozen in time, but it's not frozen in time when it was built. It's frozen in time when we decided we were not allowed to change anything anymore. And so you have this mix of buildings in downtown Charleston along the compact grid and block system, which serves relatively well. I mean, it moves people around a city moderately well. It does all those sorts of things. But what's really changed is what city planners are focused on. And for example, if you go through the Charleston plan, there are as many points on diversity as there are on building standards, or layout standards, which I don't have any particular opposition to diversity as a value, but I'm not sure there should be as many points on diversity as there are on how what planners actually do. And those old plans, things changed in downtown Charleston. We sometimes have this notion that Charleston always looked the same and that it was just frozen in time in its original form. But if you look around, you'll see a whole set of buildings of very different eras on those compact blocks. So yeah, there was the overall layout of the city, and then there was lots of change that went on within those blocks over time. And then it was frozen. And good luck making any changes to historical buildings at this point. And it will be frozen that way so long as the planners can continue to make it Gateway. On the outskirts of the city, it's not as though they don't plan out there. It's just they have a different plan that they're going to impose across the top. And again, it's somebody's constructed vision of what a city should look like. Often they're rooted in notions of we're going to build the ideal city or we're going to build the perfect city. I'm a much more Jane Jacobs, cities emerge as phenomenons, and as a result, trying to plan the particulars of a city is impossible and undesirable. I still to this day don't understand how urban planners take Jane Jacobs as their hero and then proceed to design a city plan that's going to lay out 47 zones, what's allowed in each one, and then still claim Jacobs as their patron saint. There's some disconnect there.
My question is, how often or what role does gentrification play into the planning of like Charleston?
We'll get the mic back here, but yeah, gentrification is an interesting problem. Or opportunity, depending on how you look at it. So everybody knows gentrification is the sort of change in a neighborhood's dynamic, typically characterized by rising prices and a change of the population of the neighborhood. A couple of things I would say on gentrification. One is gentrification is not a new phenomenon. We've seen neighborhoods gentrify for roughly ever. In what it does. And gentrification happens in places like Charleston. As the desirability of a city goes up, the overall cost will rise, the value of the land, of the housing stock will change, and sometimes that means that the housing stock will be eliminated altogether and replaced. Sometimes it means it will be sort of renovated, and it will end up changing the population of the neighborhood. Now, the question is, what do you do about gentrification? Because gentrification is what I think it tends to be part of the natural life and evolution of a city. And we shouldn't allow individual tragedies that occur through gentrification to become wide-scale public tragedies as we attempt to prevent change from happening in the valuation. And so my general response to arguments about gentrification is, if we want to talk about the welfare of those affected, that has to be a separate issue from what we're going to do about gentrification itself. There may well be a welfare effect and a claim to justice that we want to talk about. I just don't think that can be front and center in the planning process, or we'll never allow change to happen because we'll be stuck locked in forever. If you want to talk about the compensable side of that, you can. I'm not sure that's also a good idea given how markets operate, but I think there's separate issues that have to be addressed separately. And you can talk about those things without assuming that the only solution to gentrification is to prevent it, which is one of the major themes that's emerged. Part of what we've learned is typically one of two things happen. You either can't prevent the gentrification, it happens anyway, or you see neighborhood quality decline even further because capital leaves, because there's no longer an interest in the development. And so it's not as simple as people say that we should just stop gentrification. There's a lot more going on. There's a reason why prices have been rising, and pushing against that is a little like trying to push the boulder up the hill forever. And so it's we do not have a magic wand that makes the world the way we want it. And thank God we don't have that wand. Otherwise, the world would look a lot like all of my preferences, because I know myself. I'd run around and just tap everything with that magic wand. And we'd all drink Diet Coke and talk about economics all day. Well, and politics.
I know during the question here, but I'm going to just take one quick prerogative, and that is I'm going to point out we have Dr. Craig Richardson here with us, and he was at our Adam Smith Week last year, and there's a term he used in this context that I really liked in thinking about gentrification, and that is you can have development with displacement, or you can have development without displacement, and I think that's really sort of the thing to think about with regards to when gentrification is happening, right? So gentrification sometimes has this sort of negative connotation with it, and I think what we really want to think about is what degree of displacement's going on. So he's also here, so I would encourage you to tap on him at the end of the session.
So I'm sort of stuck on the question on the board, challenges with other approaches, and one of the first responses I think is likely to come up is how would these other approaches handle potential overstatement of harms or costs inflicted by the loss of psychic benefits in a city, such as, say, the loss of the historical value of Charleston proper, those difficult to measure costs that people are likely to overstate where the incentive exists.
We have a Zoom question, it looks like.
We do. It's just easier to read. Can you explain what Euclidean zoning is, and what is it that you would do to replace it?
Sure. So I'll take the zoning question first because that's the easier one, and then I'll try to answer Jordan's question. Euclidean zoning is just the sort of map that I put up, that each thing has its own proper location, and you don't mix different uses typically. You're going to have an industrial area, you're going to have a residential area, you're going to have a commercial area, and that's what those areas are to be used for. It came out of so it's called Euclidean zoning because of the town in which it was done in. There would eventually be a number of court cases around it, but it is setting up zones and giving cities, counties, states the ability to regulate what uses particular pieces of land can have in a particular area. What would I replace it with? Nothing. All right, let me answer Jordan's question, because I think that's the interesting one. And this is one of the major problems that comes up as soon as you invoke psychic benefits, because as soon as that's the term, and if you set any term equal to infinite, which is often what happens, then there's no way to resolve it. If you argue that there is infinite value to the historical character of Charleston that will be irrevocably destroyed by doing X, there's no room for a discussion about the costs and benefits. Instead, you have to deal with these things in sort of traditional, with what I would think are traditional property rights approaches, where you identify, and the courts are imperfect at this, but they can do it, and they can identify where they think in law the right resides, and then they can adjudicate based on that right. But if you set anything to infinite or so high that it's going to overwhelm everything else, there's no ability to do anything. And that's often the argument we hear that says we must regulate because these other things are just so valuable, we can't leave them to market transactions, or we can't leave them to court to decide how much they're valued if somebody's harmed. And we certainly can't leave them to people to just decide themselves what they're valued at. I don't buy any of that. I think that's a narrow way to think about it, because it turns out spend very long in a bidding situation with that person who claims there's infinite value to historical Charleston, we can get to a number. I don't know what it is, but we can get to a number, and as soon as you can get to a number, it's not infinite. And then suddenly it's a cost and benefit discussion. There's lots of things I claim I would never do, and only a very few of them is that actually true. The rest of them, there is a number we could assign that would induce me to go be an English professor, for example. There's a number, and sadly probably not that high, at least not as high as I would want it to be.
Any other questions? I think we had another one on, do we have another one on Zoom or no? No? Any other?
So you spoke briefly about housing in Charleston, and as a student here trying to find affordable housing, I wanted to ask you, how would you combat this issue? What would your approach be to creating more affordable housing downtown?
Well, it's really close to my response to what do you replace Euclidean zoning with? I don't think there's actually a lot that can be done. I mean, so pulling back on some of the restrictions that exist might change the dynamic a bit, but ultimately you have a market situation where the number of additional units in downtown Charleston, even if you took away all of the restrictions, this is a fairly compact area, highly desirable, so prices are going to rise. And it turns out, typically what happens in those scenarios is people they're not willing to pay the dollar cost of living close, and so they pay the time cost of moving farther out in order to do that. And that's typically what happens. My short answer is, I don't think you're going to get affordable housing in downtown Charleston, at least not of the sort that we typically talk about. You might get more affordable housing, sort of less expensive housing, but it's not going to beat the sort of definitions that we got here. And that's partly why Charleston's headed down the deeded route, to try to force the issue. I think it's an incredible folly to try to do that in any sort of consistent way.
I'm going to ask you to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Yonk for coming and speaking with us today, right? And I'm going to remind you that we have our next Adam Smith Week event at 6 o'clock tonight back here in this auditorium. I hope that you'll come back and continue this conversation on sort of urban planning and the area. This is one I think that has become very important in the area of Charleston in particular, right? And it's something that has gained my interest. I want to point out, if you will, though, that since I neglected it on the introduction, right? The relevancy, if you will, we call this Adam Smith Week, and you're asking why we're talking about housing, right? But these are issues that have gone and been with us since the beginning of time in economics, and Adam Smith was talking about these things. And so I think it's important to talk about how his ideas continue to be relevant, even if we're not directly always invoking Smith as well as Dr. Yonk did. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming out. I want you to ask you to thank Dr. Yonk one more time. Please grab some information about the center if you want to learn more, and hopefully we will see you back here this afternoon at 6 p.m. for our next talk with Dr. Emily Hamilton.